Hello and welcome to part 8 of our Azure Solutions Architect exam practice question series. We will start with question number 51 in this part. You have the Azure resources shown in the following table. The resources are virtual network with the name of VNet1, virtual machine with the name of VM1, Azure SQL database with the name of SQL DB1, private endpoint with the name of PE1, and then you have a private DNS zone and a public DNS zone. Both are named as contoso.com. Now the virtual network is connected to an on-premise network by using express route, and the virtual machine is configured as a DNS server. Azure SQL database is a single instance database, and private endpoint provides connectivity to SQL DB1. And the contoso.com private DNS zone is linked to VNet1 and contains an A record for private endpoint 1. And the public DNS zone contains a CNAME record for SQL DB1. You need to design a solution that provides on-premise network connectivity to SQL DB1 through private endpoint 1. How should you configure name resolution? And the first part of the question talks about Azure configuration. Your options are configure VM1 to forward contoso.com to the public DNS zone, configure VM1 to forward contoso.com to the Azure provided DNS at 168.63.129.16. In VNet1, configure a custom DNS server set to the Azure provided DNS at 168.63.129.16. And folks, the correct answer here is option B. Configure VM1 to forward contoso.com to the Azure provided DNS at 168.63.129.16. This setup allows the DNS server on VM1 to forward DNS queries for the contoso.com domain to the Azure provided DNS. The Azure DNS can resolve the private endpoint to its private IP address. Now, the next part of the question is on-premise DNS configuration. How should you configure that? Your options are forward contoso.com to VM1, forward contoso.com to the public DNS zone, and forward contoso.com to the Azure provided DNS at 168.63.129.16. And friends, in this case, the correct answer is option A, forward contoso.com to VM1. By configuring the on-premise DNS to forward requests for contoso.com to VM1, DNS queries for this domain will be directed to the DNS server on VM1, which will then forward them to the Azure provided DNS. Next question. You have an Azure virtual machine named VM1 that runs Windows Server 2019 and contains 500 GB of data files. You are designing a solution that will use Azure Data Factory to transform the data files and then load the files to Azure Data Lake storage. What should you deploy on VM1 to support the design? Your options are the on-premise data gateway, the Azure Pipelines agent, the self-hosted integration runtime, and Azure File Sync agent. Folks, Azure Data Factory requires an integration runtime to perform data movement and transformation between cloud and on-premise data sources. Since the data files are on VM1 and needs to be processed using ADF, self-hosted integration runtime is required to establish connectivity between the VM and the Azure Data Lake storage. Now let's understand the use case of other options. On-premise data gateway is used for Power BI, Power Apps, Power Automates, or Azure Logic Apps. Azure Pipelines agent is used for CI/CD pipelines to automate builds and deployments. Then Azure File Sync agent is used to sync file shares between on-premise Windows servers and Azure files. Next question, friends. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure Key Vault named KV1 and a virtual machine named VM1. VM1 runs Windows Server 2022 Azure Edition. You plan to deploy an ASP.NET Core-based application named App1 to VM1. You need to configure App1 to use a system-assigned managed identity to retrieve secrets from KV1. The solution must minimize development effort. What should you do? And the first part of the question talks about configure app1 to use OAuth 2.0. Your options are authorization code grant flows, client credentials grant flows, implicit grant flows. And friends, the correct answer is option B, client credentials grant flows. The client credentials flow is suitable for service-to-service communication, allowing app1 to authenticate and obtain a token to access the key vault. Now, the next part of the question is configure app1 to use a REST API call to retrieve an authentication token from the. Your options are Azure Instance Metadata Service MDS endpoint, OAuth 2.0 access token endpoint of Entra ID, OAuth 2.0 access token endpoint of Microsoft Identity Platform. And friends, the correct answer here is option A, Azure Instance Metadata Service endpoint. Now, using the IMDS endpoint is the standard way for Azure resources to obtain tokens for their managed instances, simplifying authentication without managing credentials. Question number 54. You are designing a software as a service application that will enable Entra ID users to create and publish online surveys. The SaaS application will have a front-end web app and a back-end web API. The web app will rely on the web API to handle updates to customer surveys. You need to design an authorization flow for the SaaS application. The solution must meet the following requirements. To access the backend web API, the web app must authenticate by using OAuth 2 bearer tokens, and the web app must authenticate by using the identities of individual users. What should you include in the solution? And the first part of the question talks about the access tokens will be generated by, and your options are Entra ID, web app, and web API. And folks, the access tokens will be generated by Entra ID. Entra ID will handle the authentications of user via OAuth 2.0 authorization code grant flow. After a successful user login, the web app will receive an access token from the Entra ID. The access token is a bearer token that the web app can use to make authorized calls to the web API on behalf of the logged in user. Now, the next part of the question is talking about authorization decisions will be performed by, and you again have similar three options. And in this case, the decisions will be performed by the web API. The web API will receive the access token with each request from the web app. The web API is responsible for validating the access token to ensure it is valid, unexpired, and issued by Entra ID. Based on the claims in the token, the web API can determine whether the user is authorized to perform a specific action such as updating a survey. Let's look at question number 55, friends. You have an on-premise application that consumes data from multiple databases. The application code references database tables by using a combination of the server, database, and table name. You need to migrate the application data to Azure. To which two services can you migrate the application data to achieve the goal? Your options are SQL Server Stretch Database, SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine, Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance. And friends, the correct answers here are option B and option D, as they both support cross-database queries, native SQL Server features, and server-level objects such as logins, linked servers, and agent jobs. Now, cross-database queries is the key requirement for this use case, which is not supported by Azure SQL Database, making it an incorrect choice. SQL Server Stretch Database is used to migrate cold data to Azure while keeping frequently accessed data on-premise. Next question. You plan to create an Azure storage account that will host file shares. The shares will be accessed from on-premise applications that are transaction intensive. You need to recommend a solution to minimize latency when accessing the file shares. The solution must provide the highest level of resiliency for the selected storage account. What should you include in the recommendation? And the first part of the question is talking about storage tier. Your options are hot, premium, transaction optimized? Folks, this question tests your knowledge around storage performance tiers and file share access tiers. When you create a storage account, then you only get two options, either standard or premium. And you will choose premium here because premium tier provides low latency and high throughput, which is essential for transaction intensive workloads. We will shortly head to Azure portal to understand this in more detail. But first, let's look at second part of this question. Redundancy. And your options are ZRS, ZRS, and LRS. And folks, you will need to choose ZRS here, as premium storage accounts only support LRS and ZRS. It does not support GRS. So folks, here we are in Azure portal. Let's go to storage account, try to create a storage account and see the options for ourselves. So as soon as you click on create, you are presented with the create a storage account wizard. And if you scroll down in the performance, you can see there are only two options, standard and premium. Standard is recommended for most scenarios, which is general purpose V2 account, and premium is recommended for scenarios that require low latency. This is what our question was talking about. So if you select premium, you can see the redundancy options that you get now are only LRS and ZRS. That is the reason in second part of our question, we have chosen ZRS as the correct answer. Now, if I select the standard, you can see the redundancy is showing up for all of the types, which is LRS, GRS, ZRS, GZRS. So folks, this is what I wanted to show you, which has helped me in answering the question. Now, the next thing to understand why we have not chosen hot or transaction optimized as the correct answers, let's create a storage account with standard performance tier and see what are all the options you are getting when you try to create a file share. So what we'll do is I have named my storage account as Tech with Jaspal, and then I have chosen my region as Asia Pacific, and I'm not going to change other settings at this stage. I'll click on review and create. The validation is currently in progress, which is done now. Let's click on create. The deployment shouldn't take a lot of time. I think it should take maybe a minute or maybe less than that. I'll pause the video here and I'll come back once the account has been created. So friends, our deployment is now complete and the storage account has got created. What I'll do is I'll go to the resource now and we'll head to the data storage section and select file share, because our question was talking about file shares in a storage account. And as soon as I click on file share, create file share, basically in the access tier, you can see there are three access tiers: transaction optimized, hot, and cool. Out of these, our option had transaction optimized and hot tier. This is what I wanted to show you, that those options were specific to file share, but the question was talking about the performance tier of a storage account. That is why we had to choose premium access tier. Now, and you can also see here, premium file shares are only available for premium file storage accounts. So if you have created a standard storage account, you will not be able to create a premium file share. You have to choose the option of basically premium performance when creating the storage account if you want to create a premium file share. Question number 57. You need to configure a Azure policy to ensure that the Azure SQL databases have TDE enabled. The solution must meet the security and compliance requirements. Which three actions should you perform in sequence? And the options are: create an Azure policy definition that uses the deploy if not exists effect, invoke a remediation task, create an Azure policy definition that uses the modify effect, create an Azure policy assignment, create a user managed identity. Friends, first section you need to perform is to create an Azure policy definition that uses the deploy if not exists effect. This effect ensures that if TDE is not enabled on an Azure SQL database, it will deploy the required configuration to enable it. You will define a policy rule that checks if TDE is enabled and deploy if it is not. Now, since you have created the definition, the next section would be to create policy assignment. You will assign the policy definition to a scope. Basically, it can be subscription, it can be resource group to enforce the policy, and this policy will monitor the existing and future resources in the selected scope. Finally, you will create a remediation task. This is to ensure non-compliant existing Azure SQL databases are remediated and TDEs enabled where needed. Next question, friends. You have an Azure subscription that contains a Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL account named Account 1 and an Azure Synapse Analytics workspace named Workspace 1. The Account 1 account contains a container named Container 1 that has the analytical store enabled. You need to recommend a solution that will process the data stored in Container 1 in near real time and output the results to a data warehouse in Workspace 1 by using a runtime engine in the workspace. The solution must minimize data movement. Which pool in Workspace should you use? Your options are Apache Spark, Serverless SQL, Dedicated SQL, and Data Explorer. And folks, the correct answer here is option A, Apache Spark. Now, Apache Spark is designed for near real-time processing and supports direct querying of data from Cosmos DB's analytical store without needing to move the data. It can effectively handle streaming workloads, large-scale data transformation, and analysis, making it suitable for scenarios where near real-time data insights are required. Now, Spark pools in Synapse Analytics can read data directly from the analytical store of Cosmos DB, process it, and write the results to the Synapse data warehouse. Apache Spark minimizes data movement by working directly with the analytical store of Cosmos DB, which allows querying without duplicating or moving the data. Results can be written to dedicated SQL pools or Synapse managed data warehouses, meeting the requirement of minimal data movement. You plan to deploy an Azure database for MySQL flexible server named Server 1 to the East US Azure region. You need to implement a business continuity solution for Server 1. The solution must minimize downtime in the event of a failover to a paired region. What should you do? Your options are create a read replica, store the database files in Azure Premium File Shares, implement geo-redundant backup, configure native MySQL replication. Folks, the correct answer here is option C, implement geo-redundant backup. The geo-redundant backup feature in Azure database for MySQL allows automatic backups to be stored in a different geographic region. In the event of a region-wide service disruption, you can restore the database from the geo-redundant backup, which helps minimize downtime. Other options do not provide business continuity in case of regional failures. Question number 60. You need to design a highly available Azure SQL database that meets the following requirements. Failover between replicas of the database must occur without any data loss. The database must remain available in the event of a zone outage. Costs must be minimized. Which deployment option should you use? Your options are Azure SQL Managed Instance Business Critical, Azure SQL Managed Instance General Purpose, Azure SQL Database Business Critical, Azure SQL Database Serverless. Folks, you should use Azure SQL Database Business Critical to meet the given requirements. Azure SQL Database Business Critical tier offers high availability using always-on availability groups. This ensures that failover between replicas can occur without any data loss. It provides zone redundancy, allowing the database to remain available even in the event of a zone outage. Although it has a higher cost than some other tiers, it provides the necessary features for the given requirement. Next question. You plan to migrate App 1 to Azure. You need to recommend a network connectivity solution for the Azure storage account that will host the App 1 data. The solution must meet the security and compliance requirements. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are Microsoft peering for an express route circuit, Azure public peering for an express route circuit, a service endpoint that has a service endpoint policy, a private endpoint. And friends, the correct answer in this case is option D, a private endpoint. Private endpoint allows you to connect to Azure services like storage account via private IP from within your virtual network. This ensures that traffic between your resources and the storage account stays completely within the Microsoft backbone network, avoiding exposure to the public internet. Security and compliance are enhanced because access can be restricted to only specific private networks. Question number 62. You plan to deploy multiple instances of an Azure web app across several Azure regions. You need to design an access solution for the app. The solution must meet the following replication requirements: support rate limiting, balance requests between all instances, ensure that users can access the app in the event of a regional outage, and the solution you choose is you use Azure Front Door to provide access to the app. Does this meet the goal? You need to tell whether this is right or wrong. And friends, utilizing Azure Front Door is a correct solution. Azure Front Door combined with Web Application Firewall policy will achieve all that. Azure Front Door balances requests across multiple regional instances of the web app, ensuring efficient distribution of traffic. It also allows you to configure rate limiting policies to manage traffic spikes and prevent abuse. In case of a regional outage, Front Door automatically redirects traffic to the next available instance in a healthy region, ensuring continuous availability, and Front Door also performs health probes to monitor the status of each instance and routes traffic only to healthy endpoints. So folks, I hope you now understand why I have chosen this as the correct solution. But if you still have any doubts, please post them in the comment section. Next question. You have 12 on-premise data sources that contain customer information and consist of Microsoft SQL Server, MySQL, and Oracle databases. You have an Azure subscription. You plan to create an Azure Data Lake storage account that will consolidate the customer information for analysis and reporting. You need to recommend a solution to automatically copy new information from the data sources to the Data Lake storage account by using extract, transform, and load, which is also called as ETL. The solution must minimize administrative effort. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are Azure Data Factory, Azure Data Explorer, Azure Data Share, Azure Data Studio. And friends, the correct answer here is Azure Data Factory. Azure Data Factory, also called as ADF, is the ideal solution for this scenario as it provides a scalable ETL, which is extract, transform, load service for moving data between multiple on-premise and cloud data sources. Next question. You have an Azure subscription. You need to deploy an Azure Kubernetes service solution that will use Windows Server 2019 nodes. The solution must meet the following requirements: minimize the time it takes to provision compute resources during scale-out operations, support auto-scaling of Windows Server containers. Which scaling option should you recommend? Your options are Kubernetes version 1.20.2 or newer, virtual nodes with virtual kubelet ACI, cluster autoscaler, horizontal pod autoscaler. Friends, cluster autoscaler is the most suitable option in this case. It automatically adds or removes nodes in the AKS cluster based on workload demands, ensuring the necessary compute resources are available during scale-out operations, and it minimizes the time to provision new compute resources by scaling the entire node pool, including Windows Server nodes when needed. Folks, virtual nodes with virtual kubelet ACI cannot be chosen as the correct answer in this case, as virtual nodes only support Linux nodes, whereas in this question we need to support autoscaling for Windows nodes. There is a link on your screen. If you would like to understand why cluster autoscaler has been chosen as the correct answer, then go through the link and read more about it. Question number 65. You have an Azure subscription. You need to recommend an Azure Kubernetes solution that will use Linux nodes. The solution must meet the following requirements: minimize the time it takes to provision compute resources during scale-out operations, support autoscaling of Linux containers, and minimize administrative effort. Which scaling option should you recommend? Your options are horizontal pod autoscaler, cluster autoscaler, virtual nodes, virtual kubelet. Friends, in this question, we are talking about Linux container. So following up on explanation provided in the last question, you will use virtual nodes. With virtual nodes, you have quick provisioning of pods and only pay per second for their execution time. You don't need to wait for Kubernetes cluster autoscaler to deploy VM compute nodes to run more pods. So folks, I hope you now understand what is the difference between the two questions that we just had. One of the question was focused around Windows nodes and the other one is focused around Linux node. That is the reason why the right choice has changed in both the questions. Next question. Your company plans to deploy various Azure App Service instances that will use Azure SQL databases. The app service instances will be deployed at the same time as the Azure SQL databases. The company has a regulatory requirement to deploy the app service instances only to specific Azure regions. The resources for the app service instances must reside in the same region. You need to recommend a solution to meet the regulatory requirement. And the solution you choose is, you recommend using the regulatory compliance dashboard in Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Does this meet the goal? You need to tell whether this solution is right or wrong. And friends, this is an incorrect solution. The regulatory compliance dashboard in Microsoft Defender for Cloud helps monitor and assess compliance with various industry standards, but it does not control or restrict the deployment of resources to specific regions. It is primarily used for reporting compliance and providing recommendations to improve the security posture of your environment. You should use Azure policy to meet the given requirement. So folks, we have almost covered 70 questions in the series till now. So if you are someone who is looking to get PDF access to all the questions that we have covered in the series till now, then you can gain access to the PDF by joining the channel as a gold member. You just need to email us at devopsup2023@gmail.com requesting your PDF copy once you have taken the membership. So now friends, if you are someone who doesn't like to commit to a monthly membership, even though you have option to cancel it at any time, we do have one-time payment options as well. Just email us at devopsup2023@gmail.com requesting further information about the one-time payment options. Question number 67. You plan to move a web app named App1 from an on-premise data center to Azure. App1 depends on a custom COM component that is installed on the host server. You need to recommend a solution to host App1 in Azure. The solution must meet the following requirements. App1 must be available to users if an Azure data center becomes unavailable. Costs must be minimized. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are: in two Azure regions, deploy a load balancer and a web app. In two Azure regions, deploy a load balancer and a virtual machine scale set. Deploy a load balancer and a virtual machine scale set across two availability zones. In two Azure regions, deploy an Azure Traffic Manager profile and a web app. Folks, web apps do not support COM components, so you can straight away rule out option A and option D. Both of the remaining options satisfy first requirement of high availability in case of Azure data center failure. but we need to minimize the costs as well based on the second requirement. So we will eliminate option B here. Option C would be ideal as we are just looking for redundancy in case of data center failure and not region failure. Folks, if you are liking the content, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe the channel. Question number 68. You are developing a sales application that will contain several Azure cloud services and handle different components of a transaction. Different cloud services will process customer orders, billing, payment, inventory, and shipping. You need to recommend a solution to enable the cloud services to asynchronously communicate transaction information by using XML messages. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are Azure Notification Hubs, Azure Service Fabric, Azure Queue Storage, Azure Data Lake. Folks, the most suitable option for enabling asynchronous communication between the given services is Azure Queue Storage. Azure Queue Storage allows decoupled services to communicate asynchronously by using a message-based architecture, and it supports plain text messages, including XML formatted messages, making it suitable for this use case. You are designing a point of sale solution that will be deployed across multiple locations and will use an Azure Databricks workspace in the standard tier. The solution will include multiple apps deployed to the on-premise network of each location. You need to configure the authentication method that will be used by the app to access the workspace. The solution must minimize the administrative effort associated with the staff turnover and credential management. What should you configure? Your options are a managed identity, a service principal, a personal access token. Folks, the keyword to answer this question is that multiple apps of the solution are deployed to the on-premise network. So you cannot use managed identity. This leaves us with service principal and personal access token, which both can fulfill the job. However, we need to minimize the administrative effort associated with staff turnover, and personal access token will introduce overhead as they are bound to a particular staff. So we can rule out that as well. This leaves us with the correct choice, service principal, which is an identity created for use with applications, hosted services, and automated tools to access Azure resources. The access is restricted by the roles assigned to the service principal, giving you control over which resources can be accessed and at what level. Next question. Your company has the divisions shown in the following table. Basically, there are two divisions with the name of East and West. Now, East division is hosted in the Azure subscription named Sub 1, and it has an Entra tenant associated with it with name of contoso.com. Then the second division named as West is using the subscription as Sub 2 and is associated with Entra tenant as fabricum.com. Sub 1 contains an Azure App Service web app named App1. App1 uses Entra ID for single tenant user authentication. Users from contoso.com can authenticate to App1. You need to recommend a solution to enable users in the fabricam.com tenant to authenticate to App1. What should you recommend? Your options are configure a conditional access policy, use Entra ID entitlement management to govern external users, configure the Entra ID provisioning service, configure Entra ID identity protection. Folks, you should make use of Entra ID entitlement management to govern external users. This feature allows you to manage access for external users, including those from different Entra ID tenants. You can invite users from fabricam.com to access App1, which effectively enables cross-tenant authentication. Question number 71. Your company has offices in New York City, Sydney, Paris, Johannesburg. The company has an Azure subscription. You plan to deploy a new Azure networking solution that meets the following requirements. Connects to express route circuits in the Azure regions of East US, Southeast Asia, North Europe, and South Africa. minimizes latency by supporting connection in 3 regions, supports site-to-site VPN connections, minimizes costs. You need to identify the minimum number of Azure Virtual WAN hubs that you must deploy and which virtual WAN SKU to use. What should you identify? The first part of the question is talking about number of virtual WAN hubs, and your options are 1, 2, 3, and 4. Folks, you should deploy 3 Azure Virtual WAN hubs. Each virtual WAN hub can connect to an express route circuit, so having hubs in strategic locations allows you to utilize this feature effectively. By deploying hubs in 3 different regions, you can provide optimal routing and minimize latency for connections from the offices in New York City, Sydney, and Paris, which is one of the requirements. Now, the next part of the question is talking about virtual WAN SKU, and the options are basic or standard. And folks, basic SKU doesn't support express route, so you have to choose a standard SKU in this case. There is a link on your screen. I would highly recommend you to go through the link to understand more about virtual WANs. Question number 72. You need to design a highly available Azure SQL database that meets the following requirements. Failover between replicas of the database must occur without any data loss. The database must remain available in the event of a zone outage. Cost must be minimized. Which deployment option should you use? Your options are Azure SQL Database Hyperscale, Azure SQL Database Premium, Azure SQL Database Basic, Azure SQL Database Serverless. Folks, Azure SQL Database Premium is the recommended option as it offers advanced features like active geo-replication and automatic data loss free failover. It also supports high availability in case of zone outages, ensuring the database remains accessible even if a specific zone experiences an interruption. Next question, friends. You are developing a multi-tier app named App1 that will be hosted on Azure virtual machines. The peak utilization periods for App1 will be from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. on weekdays. You need to deploy the infrastructure for App1. The solution must meet the following requirements. Support virtual machines deployed to 4 availability zones across 2 Azure regions. Minimize cost by accumulating CPU credits during periods of low utilization. What is the minimum number of virtual networks you should deploy and which virtual machine size should you use? And the first part of the question is talking about number of virtual networks. And your options are 1, 2, 3, and 4. Folks, you need at least 1 virtual network per Azure region for the resources. Since you have 2 Azure regions in the question, you will need at least 2 virtual networks. Now, the next part of the question is talking about virtual machine size. And your options are A series, B series, D series, and M series. The B series VM size is the best choice here because of the ability to bank CPU credits during periods of low utilization. The B series are burstable VMs that accumulate CPU credits during idle times and then consume these credits during periods of high CPU usage. Question number 74. You have an on-premise Microsoft SQL server named SQL1 that hosts 50 databases. You plan to migrate SQL1 to Azure SQL managed instance. You need to perform an offline migration of SQL1. The solution must minimize administrative effort. What should you include in the solution? Your options are Azure Migrate, Azure Database Migration Service, SQL Server Migration Assistant, Data Migration Assistant. Now, folks, for an offline migration of an on-premise SQL Server to Azure SQL Managed Instance, the best choice is to include Azure Database Migration Service in the solution. Azure Database Migration Service is a fully managed service designed to enable seamless migrations from multiple database sources to Azure data platforms with minimal downtime by allowing online migration, but it also supports offline migrations. Now let's understand what is the use case of other services being talked about here. Azure Migrate provides a broader set of migration capabilities for various workloads, but is not specifically tailored for SQL database migrations. SQL Server Migration Assistant is primarily for migrating SQL Server databases to newer SQL Server versions or Azure SQL databases, but it's less suited for large-scale offline migrations compared to DMS, which is Database Migration Service. Now, Data Migration Assistant is useful for assessing SQL Server databases and identifying compatibility issues, but does not handle the actual migration process itself. So folks, I hope you now understand the use case of all the 4 Azure services being talked about in the question. But if you still have any doubts, please post them in the comment section. Let's look at question number 75. You plan to deploy an infrastructure solution that will contain the following configurations. External users will access the infrastructure by using Azure Front Door. External user access to the backend APIs hosted in Azure Kubernetes Service will be controlled by using Azure API Management. External users will be authenticated by an Entra ID B2C tenant that uses OpenID Connect-based federation with a third-party identity provider. Which function does each service provide? Each function may be used once, more than once, or not at all. Now, there are 3 functions being mentioned here, and those are protection against open web application security project vulnerabilities, IP filtering on a per API level, validation of Azure B2C JSON web tokens, which is also called as JOT tokens. And the 2 services that are being talked about here are Front Door and API Management. Now, folks, Azure Front Door provides web application firewall capabilities that protects against open web application security project vulnerabilities, such as SQL injection and cross-site scripting. This ensures that requests are filtered for malicious content before reaching backend services. Azure API Management can validate JOTs issued by Entra ID B2C. API Management can enforce authentication policies that check the token's validity and ensure it's issued by the trusted Entra ID B2C tenant, thereby enabling secure access to APIs. So folks, if you are liking the content, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe the channel. Let's look at question number 76 of the series. Your on-premise data center contains a server that runs Linux and hosts a Java app named App1. App1 has the following characteristics. App1 is an interactive app that users access by using HTTPS connections. The number of connections to App1 changes significantly throughout the day. App1 runs multiple concurrent instances. App1 requires major changes to run in a container. You plan to migrate App1 to Azure. You need to recommend a compute solution for App1. The solution must meet the following requirements. The solution must run multiple instances of App1. The number of instances must be managed automatically depending on the load. Administrative effort must be minimized. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are Azure Batch, Azure App Service, Azure Kubernetes Service, Azure Virtual Machine Scale Sets. Now, folks, the first thing you need to take into consideration is App1 requires major changes to run in a container, and you need to minimize administrative effort so you can safely rule out AKS. Now, Azure Batch does not support HTTPS-based user interactive applications directly, so we can rule that out as well. Now, App Service and Virtual Machine Scale Set, which is VMSS, both can be used to fulfill the requirement, but we need to minimize administrative efforts, so we will rule out Virtual Machine Scale Set, which is option D. Azure App Service is ideal for hosting web apps and APIs. It supports HTTPS connections, automatic scaling based on load, and multiple instances, all while minimizing administrative overhead. So folks, I hope you now understand why I have chosen Azure App Service as the correct answer here. Next question. You have a Microsoft Entra tenant. You plan to deploy Azure Cosmos DB databases that will use the SQL API. You need to recommend a solution to provide specific Entra ID user accounts with read access to the Cosmos DB databases. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are shared access signature, SAS, and conditional access policies, certificates and Azure Key Vault, master keys and Azure information protection policies, a resource token, and an access control IAM role assignment. Folks, Azure Cosmos DB supports Azure AD-based RBAC. You can assign roles through Azure's identity and access management for granular access control, including read-only access to specific Cosmos DB resources. A resource token is issued by Azure Cosmos DB to grant restricted access to resources, making this a viable option when combined with IAM. Again, there is a link on your screen on how to use resource tokens with Azure Cosmos DB. Go through the link to understand this process in more detail. So friends, we now almost have 80 questions in our Azure Solutions Architect Expert exam practice question series. So if you are someone who is looking to gain PDF access to all the questions that we have covered in the series till now, then do not forget to take the gold membership of the channel and email me at devopshub2023@gmail.com requesting the PDF copy. Question number 78. You have an Azure subscription. Your on-premise network contains a file server named Server 1. Server 1 stores 5 TB of company files that are accessed rarely. You plan to copy the files to Azure storage. You need to implement a storage solution for the files that meets the following requirements. The files must be available within 24 hours of being requested. Storage costs must be minimized. Which two possible storage solutions achieve this goal? Your options are create an Azure Blob storage account that is configured for the cool access tier, create a blob container, copy the files to the blob container, and set each file to the archive access tier. Second option is create a general purpose V1 storage account, create a blob container and copy the files to the blob container. The third option is create a general purpose V2 storage account that is configured for the cool default access tier. Create a file share in the storage account and copy the files to the file share. Fourth option is create a general purpose V2 storage account that is configured for the hot default access tier. Create a blob container, copy the files to the blob container and set each file to the archive access tier. And the final option is create a general purpose V1 storage account. Create a file share in the storage account and copy the files to the file share. Now folks, option A allows for cost-efficient storage with the cool and archive tier. The archive tier is designed for rarely accessed data and offers the lowest storage cost. Files in the archive tier may take several hours to retrieve, which is like up to 24 hours. So it seems to be a suitable choice for our requirement. Now, option B includes general purpose V1 storage accounts, which do not support access tiers like pool or archive. So it does not offer a way to minimize cost for rarely accessed data, therefore an incorrect choice. Third option includes general purpose V2 accounts, which support access tiers that help reduce storage costs. However, Azure file shares do not support archive tiers, so you would only have access to the hot or cool tiers. While the cool tier offers cost savings, it's not as cost effective as the archive tier for infrequently accessed files, so we can exclude it for now and see if we have a better option. Option D includes using the archive access tier, which provides the lowest cost for rarely accessed data, and retrieval can be completed within the 24-hour time frame. The default hot access tier would not impact costs if files are directly placed in the archive tier. So this is the second correct option. And we will rule out option E due to the same reason we used for ruling out option B. You need to recommend a solution to integrate Azure Cosmos DB and Azure Synapse. The solution must meet the following requirements. Traffic from an Azure Synapse workspace to the Azure Cosmos DB account must be sent via the Microsoft Backbone network. Traffic from the Azure Synapse workspace to the Azure Cosmos DB account must not be routed over the internet. Implementation effort must be minimized. What should you include in the recommendation? The first part of the question is talking about when provisioning the Azure Synapse workspace, your options are configure a dedicated managed virtual network, disable public network access to the workspace endpoints, enable the use of Entra ID authentication. Folks, you should provision the Azure Synapse workspace with the option to configure a dedicated managed virtual network. This will ensure that the traffic between Azure Synapse and Azure Cosmos DB is routed through the Microsoft backbone network and not over the internet. Now, the second part of the question is talking about when configuring the Azure Cosmos DB account, enable, and your options are managed private endpoints, server level firewall rules, service endpoint policies. Folks, you should configure the Azure Cosmos DB account to use managed private endpoints. This will allow Azure Synapse to securely connect to Azure Cosmos DB using a private link. Next question. You have an on-premise data center named Site 1. Site 1 contains a VMware vSphere cluster named Cluster 1 that hosts 100 virtual machines. Cluster 1 is managed by using VMware vCenter. You have an Azure subscription named Sub 1. You plan to migrate the virtual machines from Cluster 1 to Sub 1. You need to identify which resources are required to run the virtual machines in Azure. The solution must minimize administrative effort. What should you configure? Now, in terms of resources, your options are an Azure Migrate appliance, an Azure Migrate project, an Azure VMware Solution Private Cloud, an Azure VMware Solution Host. Now you need to tell which of these resources should be created in subscription 1 and which of them should be created in cluster 1. Folks, you should deploy an Azure Migrate project in sub 1. This is the project within Azure Migrate where the collected data and migration processes are managed. It helps you track the progress of the migration, assess compatibility, and prepare for moving workloads to Azure. You need to use the Azure Migrate appliance to discover and assess the VMs on cluster 1. This appliance is required for discovery and assessment of on-premise VMware environment. It collects data from VMware environment and sends it to Azure Migrate to help understand which resources are required in Azure. So folks, I hope you now understand why I have chosen an Azure Migrate project needs to be created in subscription 1 and an Azure Migrate appliance needs to be created in cluster 1. But if you still have any doubts, please post them in the comments section. Question number 81. You need to recommend a solution to generate a monthly report of all the new Azure Resource Manager resource deployments in your subscription. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are Azure Log Analytics, Azure Arc, Azure Analysis Services, Azure Monitor Action Groups. Now, the recommended solution in this case is Azure Log Analytics, which is a service within Azure Monitor that collects and analyzes log data from various Azure resources. It allows you to query the activity logs and extract details about ARM deployments. By leveraging Azure Log Analytics, you can set up a query that filters out the resource deployment events and generates a monthly report. There is a link on your screen. Go through the link to understand more about Azure Log Analytics. Next question. You have an Azure subscription that contains the resources shown in the following table. You basically have 5 resources. The first one is named as contoso.com and it is Azure private DNS zone. Then you have 3 virtual networks with the name of VNet1, VNet2, and VNet3. VNet1 is linked to contoso.com and paired with VNet2. VNet2 is also linked to contoso.com and paired with VNet1. VNet3 is also linked to contoso.com and isolated from VNet1 and VNet2. Then you have a log analytics workspace named Workspace 1, which is used to store logs collected from virtual machines on all the virtual networks. VNet 1, VNet 2, and VNet 3 each has multiple virtual machines connected. The virtual machines use the Azure DNS service for name resolution. You need to recommend an Azure Monitor log routing solution that meets the following requirements. Ensure that the logs collected from the virtual machines and sent to Workspace 1 are routed over the Microsoft Backbone network. Minimize administrative effort. What should you include in the recommendation? Now, the first part of the question is talking about minimum number of Azure Monitor Private Link Scope Objects, AMPLS. Your options are 1, 2, and 3. Folks, you can use a single AMPLS to connect multiple VNets to a log analytics workspace. This minimizes administrative overhead. Now, the next part of the question talks about minimum number of private endpoints. Again, your options are 1, 2, or 3. You will need a total of 2 private endpoints, one private endpoint for VNet 1 and VNet 2 since they are paired, and one private endpoint for VNet 3 since it is an isolated one. Next question, friends. You have 100 Azure storage accounts. Access to the accounts is restricted by using Azure role-based access control assignments. You need to recommend a solution that uses role assignment conditions based on the tags assigned to individual resources within the storage accounts. What should you include in the recommendation? The first part of the question is talking about implement role assignment conditions by using, your options are access control lists, attribute-based access control, shared access signatures. The correct answer here is attribute-based access control, which is also called as ABAC, which is an authorization model that allows you to assign roles with conditions based on attributes of the resources or users, such as tags on Azure resources. ACLs are typically used for managing access at a more granular level, such as file or folder permissions within Azure files or blob storage. They are not used for setting access conditions based on tags or attributes. Now, SaaS provides delegated time-limited access to specific resources in your Azure storage account. However, it is not used for setting access policies based on attributes like tags. The next part of the question is talking about assign permissions to, and your options are blobs, files, or tables. The most common use case for granular access control is typically blobs. So I will choose blobs as the correct choice here. Folks, refer to the link on your screen to understand some examples of how to achieve this solution practically. Question number 84. You need to design a solution that will execute custom C# code in response to an event routed to Azure Event Grid. The solution must meet the following requirements. The executed code must be able to access the private IP address of a Microsoft SQL Server instance that runs on an Azure virtual machine. Costs must be minimized. What should you include in the solution? Your options are Azure Logic Apps in the consumption plan, Azure Functions in the premium plan, Azure Functions in the consumption plan, Azure Logic Apps in the integrated service environment. Folks, first thing to take into consideration is the need to run custom C# code. So you can rule out any options containing Azure Logic Apps, as Logic Apps are not designed to run custom code. Logic Apps are a low-code or no-code service designed to orchestrate workflows using built-in connectors and actions. This leaves us with both the options related to Azure Functions. Now, folks, the first requirement is to access the private IP address of SQL Server instance that runs on the Azure virtual machines, which means they are referring to utilizing the virtual network integration feature, which is not available in the consumption plan. This leaves us with option B, which is Azure Functions in the premium plan, as the right answer. As always, folks, there is a link on your screen for you to review more details about the Azure Functions premium plan. Question number 85. You plan to deploy 10 applications to Azure. The applications will be deployed to two Azure Kubernetes clusters, which is AKS clusters. Each cluster will be deployed to a separate Azure region. The application deployment must meet the following requirements. Ensure that the applications remain available if a single AKS cluster fails. Ensure that the connection traffic over the internet is encrypted by using SSL without having to configure SSL on each container. Which service should you include in the recommendation? Your options are Azure Front Door, Azure Traffic Manager, AKS Ingress Controller, Azure Load Balancer. Now friends, Azure Front Door would be the appropriate choice in this use case. Let's understand the reason that helped in eliminating other options. Azure Traffic Manager is a DNS-based load balancer, but it operates at the DNS level, not at the application layer, which is what we need here. AKS Ingress Controller does not handle traffic distribution between regions. You would need to manage separate ingress controllers for each cluster and use another service like Traffic Manager for multi-region failover. Now, Azure Load Balancer operates at layer 4. It is designed for regional load balancing and cannot route traffic across different regions. So folks, I hope you now understand why I have chosen Azure Front Door as the correct choice here. Question number 86. You have 5 Azure subscriptions. Each subscription is linked to a separate Entra ID tenant and contains virtual machines that run Windows Server 2022. You plan to collect Windows security events from the virtual machines and send them to a single log analytics workspace. You need to recommend a solution that meets the following requirements: collects event logs from multiple subscriptions, supports the use of data collection rules, which is DCRs, to define which events to collect. What should you recommend for each requirement? The first part of the question is talking about the requirement to collect the event logs. And your options are Azure Event Grid, Azure Lighthouse, Azure Purview. Folks, with Azure Lighthouse, you can gain cross-tenant management capabilities, allowing you to collect data from VMs across different subscriptions and tenants into a single log analytics workspace. This is the reason why we have chosen Azure Lighthouse as the correct answer. Now, the next part of the question is talking about what you need to do to support the DCRs. And your options are the Log Analytics Agent, the Azure Monitor Agent, the Azure Connected Machine Agent. Now friends, DCRs are a part of Azure Monitor and are used to define the data you want to collect and send to a Log Analytics workspace. Using Azure Monitor combined with Azure Lighthouse, you can define DCRs that span across multiple subscriptions managed through Lighthouse. So folks, Azure Monitor Agent is the recommended agent for new deployments because it is only agent that supports DCRs. Next question. You have an Azure subscription that contains multiple storage accounts. You assign Azure policy definitions to these storage accounts. You need to recommend a solution to meet the following requirements: trigger on-demand Azure policy compliance scans, raise Azure Monitor non-compliance alerts by querying logs collected by Log Analytics. What should you recommend for each requirement? The first requirement is to trigger the compliance scans use. Your options are an Azure template, the Azure command line interface, the Azure portal. Folks, you should use Azure command line interface to trigger on-demand compliance scans. An evaluation scan for a subscription or a resource group can be started with Azure CLI, Azure PowerShell, a call to the REST API, or by using the Azure Policy Compliance Scan GitHub action. This scan is an asynchronous process. So folks, instead of Azure CLI, if you had Azure PowerShell or a call to the REST API or even Azure Policy Compliance Scan GitHub action in the option, those would have also been the correct choice. Now, the next part of the question is talking about what should you include in the recommendation to generate the non-compliance alerts. Configure diagnostic settings for your options are Azure Activity Logs, Log Analytics Workspace, Storage Account. You should configure diagnostic settings for the Azure Activity Logs. By configuring diagnostic settings for Azure Activity Logs, you can send this data to a log analytics workspace. This enables you to query non-compliance events and create alerts in Azure Monitor. So folks, we have almost 90 questions in the AZ-305 exam practice question series. So if you are someone who is looking to gain PDF access to all the questions that we have covered in the series till now, then do not forget to take the gold membership of the channel and just email us at devopshub2023@gmail.com requesting your PDF copy. We do have one-time payment options as well. So if you are someone who doesn't want to take membership, you can again reach out to us at devopshub2023@gmail.com requesting further information about the one-time payment options. Question number 88. You need to recommend an Azure storage solution that meets the following requirements. The storage must support 1 petabyte of data. The data must be stored in blob storage. The storage must support 3 levels of subfolders. The storage must support access control lists. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are a premium storage account that is configured for block blobs, a general purpose V2 storage account that has hierarchical namespace enabled, a premium storage account that is configured for page blobs, a premium storage account that is configured for file shares and supports large file shares. Now, one of the requirement is that we require access control lists, which requires either block blob storage or general purpose V2. So we can rule out option C and option D. Now, other requirement is to support 3 level of subfolders, which means we need hierarchical namespace enabled, which is only supported by general purpose V2 storage account. With hierarchical namespace enabled, the storage account behaves like Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, which supports access control lists as well, which is another requirement. Before we proceed, folks, I would like to introduce you to my TopMate profile. If you are seeking guidance on clearing certification exams, considering a career transition into DevOps or cloud computing, or require support with resume reviews or mock interviews, you can easily schedule a one-to-one session with me via TopMate. You will also find digital products available for purchase, including PDF version of all the certification questions featured on the channel. PDF will be available for download instantly as soon as purchase is completed. For any specific queries, feel free to use the priority DM option. I will respond as soon as possible. Do not forget to take advantage of the tips and coupon codes available at the top of my TopMate profile to enjoy these benefits at minimal cost. Friends, link to my TopMate profile is available in the description section of this video. You have the Azure subscriptions shown in the following table. Basically, you have 2 subscriptions with the name of Sub 1 and Sub 2. Both of these are in East US location, and the Enter ID tenant associated with Sub 1 is contoso.onmicrosoft.com, and the Enter ID tenant associated with Sub 2 is contoso-recovery.onmicrosoft.com. Now, contoso.onmicrosoft.com contains a user named user1. You need to deploy a solution to protect against ransomware attacks. The solution must meet the following requirements. Ensure that all the resources in Sub 1 are backed up by using Azure Backup. Require that user 1 first be assigned a role for Sub 2 before the user can make major changes to the backup configuration. What should you create in each subscription? Now, for the Sub 1, your options are a recovery services vault, a resource guard, an Azure site recovery job, Microsoft Azure backup server, Microsoft Azure recovery services agent, also called as Mars agent. Folks, our recovery services vault is necessary for using Azure Backup to protect and manage the backups of the resources in Sub 1. It provides a centralized management interface for backup and recovery options. Now, friends, the second part of the question is talking about what should you create in sub 2. And again, you have all the five options that you had in first part of the question. Folks, a resource guard helps protect backup and recovery configurations by requiring additional authentication and authorization before any critical operations such as disabling backups or deleting recovery points can be performed. It ensures that user 1 must be assigned a role for sub 2 before making major changes. So friends, in sub 1, you are going to create a recovery services vault, and in sub 2, you are going to create a resource guard to fulfill the requirements given in the question. Next question. You need to deploy resources to host a stateless web app in an Azure subscription. The solution must meet the following requirements: provide access to the full .NET framework, provide redundancy if an Azure region fails, grant administrators access to the operating system to install custom application dependencies. Now, the solution you choose is you deploy two Azure virtual machines to two Azure regions and you create a Azure Traffic Manager profile. Does this meet the goal? You need to tell whether this solution is right or wrong. And friends, this meets the goal. By deploying two Azure virtual machines in two separate Azure regions, you provide redundancy if one of the region fails. Azure Traffic Manager can be used to distribute traffic between the virtual machines in different regions, ensuring high availability, and deploying Azure virtual machines allows you to have access to the full .NET framework and grants administrator the ability to access the operating system to install custom application dependencies. Next question. You have an Azure subscription that contains the resources shown in the following table. You basically have five resources. The first one is with the name of VNet1, which is a virtual network type, and it is not having any description. The second one is LB1, which is a public load balancer type, which includes a backend pool named BP1. The third one is a VMSS1 name, which is a Azure Virtual Machine Scale Sets type and is included in BP1 and connected to VNet1. Now you have two network virtual appliances with the name of NVA1 and NVA2. NVA1 is connected to VNet1 and performs security filtering of traffic for VMSS1, and NVA2 is also connected to VNet1 and performs security filtering of traffic for VMSS1. You need to recommend a load balancing solution that will distribute incoming traffic for VMSS1 across NVA1 and NVA2. The solution must minimize administrative effort. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are Gateway Load Balancer, Azure Front Door, Azure Application Gateway, Azure Traffic Manager. Friends, Gateway Load Balancer is an SKU of Azure Load Balancer portfolio catered for high performance and high availability scenarios with third-party network virtual appliances. With the capabilities of Gateway Load Balancer, you can easily deploy, scale, and manage NBAs. So friends, there is a link on your screen at the moment. Go through the link to understand more about Gateway Load Balancer, as this will help you in answering many more variations of these type of questions. Question number 92. You are planning an Azure storage solution for sensitive data. The data will be accessed daily. The data set is less than 10 GB. You need to recommend a storage solution that meets the following requirements. All the data written to storage must be retained for 5 years. Once the data is written, the data can only be read. Modifications and deletions must be prevented. After 5 years, the data can be deleted but never modified. Data access charges must be minimized. What should you recommend? The first part of the question is talking about storage account type. And your options are premium block blobs, general purpose V2 with cool access tier for blobs, general purpose V2 with hot access tier for blobs. Folks, the correct answer here is option C. The hot access tier of general purpose V2 storage account provides lower data access costs compared to the cool access tier, making it more suitable for minimizing charges. Though the cool access tier has lower storage costs, the data access charges are higher, making it a incorrect choice. Premium block blobs are meant for high performance scenarios and not ideal in this use case. Now, the next part of the question is talking about configuration to prevent modifications and deletions. And your options are container access level, container access policy, storage account resource lock. Folks, container access policy would be ideal configuration to prevent modifications and deletions of data. You can create a container access policy with specific permissions like read only and set an expiry time of 5 years. This policy prevents modifications and deletions while still allowing the data to be read. After 5 years, the policy will expire and the data can be deleted but not modified. Question number 93 of the series. You have 10 on-premise servers that run Windows Server. You need to perform daily backups of the servers to a recovery services vault. The solution must meet the following requirements. Backup all the files and folders on the servers. Maintain 3 copies of the backups in Azure. Minimize costs. What should you configure? The first part of the question is talking about on the servers. The Azure Site Recovery Mobility Service, the Microsoft Azure Recovery Services Agent, Volume Shadow Copy Service, which is VSS. Friends, Azure Backup uses the Mars agent to backup the files, folders, and system state from on-premise machines and Azure VMs. These machines can be backed up directly to a recovery services vault in Azure. Now, the second part of the question is talking about for the storage, and your options are geo-redundant storage, locally redundant storage, and zone redundant storage. Friends, you will need to use locally redundant storage in this use case as you need to maintain 3 copies of the backup while minimizing costs. Now let's understand why their options are incorrect. Now, geo-redundant storage provides geographic redundancy by copying data to a secondary region, which is unnecessary for this scenario as it will increase the costs as there will be a total of 6 copies maintained. Zone redundant storage ensures redundancy across multiple availability zones in a single region, but is costlier than LRS, so an incorrect choice in this use case. With this, let's look at question number 94 of the series. You plan to deploy a containerized web app that will be hosted in 5 Azure Kubernetes service clusters. Each cluster will be hosted in a different Azure region. You need to provide access to the app from the internet. The solution must meet the following requirements. Incoming HTTPS request must be routed to the cluster that has the lowest network latency. HTTPS traffic to individual pods must be routed via an ingress controller. In the event of an AKS cluster outage, failover time must be minimized. What should you include in the solution? The first part of the question is talking about for global load balancing. And your options are Azure Front Door, Azure Traffic Manager, cross-region load balancing in Azure, standard load balancer. Now, friends, Azure Front Door provides application level routing to route HTTPS traffic to the backend with the lowest network latency among the given options. It integrates seamlessly with AKS ingress controllers to route HTTPS traffic directly to pods within the AKS clusters and has near instant failover capabilities, minimizing downtime in the event of an AKS cluster outage. Now, the next part of the question is talking about as an ingress controller. What should you include? Your options are Azure Application Gateway, Azure Standard Load Balancer, Basic Azure Load Balancer. And folks, Azure Application Gateway is the correct choice here. Azure Application Gateway can function as an ingress controller for AKS using the Application Gateway Ingress Controller. It supports secure HTTPS traffic routing and integrates with AKS for pod level traffic management. Application Gateway includes health probes to monitor backend health and automatically reroutes traffic in case of failures, ensuring high availability. Folks, if you're liking the content, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe the channel. Let's look at question number 95 of the series. You have an Azure subscription. You create a storage account that will store documents. You need to configure the storage account to meet the following requirements. Ensure that retention policies are standardized across the subscription. Ensure that data can be purged if the data is copied to an unauthorized location. Which two settings should you enable? Now there is an exhibit in front of you and you need to decide which two settings you can use to implement the given requirements. I think the first setting that you should check here is enable operational backup with Azure Backup, as this will address the first requirement of standardizing the retention policies across the subscription. Now, the next setting you will have to enable, which will address the second requirement of ensuring the data can be purged, is enable permanent delete for soft deleted items. Folks, if you have any doubts on why I have chosen these settings, then do not forget to post them in the comment section. Question number 96 of the series. You have an Azure subscription. You are designing a solution for containerized apps. The solution must meet the following requirements. Automatically scale the apps by creating additional instances. Minimize administrative effort to maintain nodes and clusters. Ensure that containerized apps are highly available across multiple availability zones. Provide a central location for the lifecycle management and storage of container images. What should you include in the solution? The first part of the question is talking about to run the containerized app. Your options are Azure Container Apps, Azure Container Instances, Azure Container Registry, Azure Kubernetes Service. And folks, you should use Azure Container Apps in this case, as applications built on Azure Container Apps can dynamically scale based on HTTP traffic, CPU, or memory load, and they also support event-driven processing. Now, the second part of the question is talking about for the lifecycle management and storage of container images. Your options are Azure Container Apps, Azure Container Instances, Azure Container Registry, Azure Service Fabric. You will need to make use of Azure Container Registry for the lifecycle management of container images, as it is a dedicated service for storing and managing container images. It provides a central repository for container lifecycle management, including building, storing, scanning, and deploying container images. ACR supports tasks for automating container image builds and updates, and ACR integrates seamlessly with Azure Kubernetes Service, Azure Container Apps, and even Azure Container Instances for deploying containerized workloads. Next question, friends. You plan to use Azure Storage to store data assets. You need to identify the procedure to fail over a general purpose V2 account as part of a disaster recovery plan. The solution must meet the following requirements. Apps must be able to access the storage account after a failover. You must be able to fail back the storage account to the original location. Downtime must be minimized. Which three actions should you perform in sequence? After a failover, configure geo-redundant storage replication for the account. Initiate a failover. Before a failover, configure zone-redundant storage replication for the storage account. Before a failover, configure geo-redundant storage replication for the storage account. After a failover, configure zone-redundant storage replication for the storage account. Folks, pay attention to the options because they are very confusing. Folks, the first step would be to configure geo-redundant storage replication for the storage account. GRS replicates data asynchronously to a secondary region, ensuring that data is available in another Azure region for disaster recovery failover. And this will be followed by initiating a failover. After the failover, your storage account is automatically converted to locally redundant storage in the new primary region. You need to re-enable geo-redundant storage as the final step in the process. There is a link on your screen which will provide more details about the storage account failover. Go through the link to understand this process in more detail. Now, folks, if you are someone who is looking to get access to the PDF version of all the questions that we have covered in the series till now, then do not forget to take the gold membership of the channel and then just email us at devopshub2023@gmail.com requesting the PDF copy. We do have one-time payment options as well. In case someone wants to just utilize those, then email us at devopshub2023@gmail.com requesting further information about the one-time payment options. Question number 98 of the series. You have the Azure resources shown in the following table. You basically have two resources, and the first one is the Azure Synapse Analytic instance with the name of AS1, and the second one is Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL account with the name of CDB1. Now, CDB1 hosts a container that stores continuously updated operational data. You are designing a solution that will use AS1 to analyze the operational data daily. You need to recommend a solution to analyze the data without affecting the performance of the operational data store. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are Azure Data Factory with Azure Cosmos DB and Azure Synapse Analytics connectors, Azure Synapse Analytics with poly-based data loading, Azure Synapse Link for Azure Cosmos DB, Azure Cosmos DB change feed. Folks, you should use Azure Synapse Link for Cosmos DB here. Azure Synapse Link enables near real-time analytics on operational data in Azure Cosmos DB without affecting the performance of the operational database. It eliminates the need to ETL, which is extract, transform, and load the data to a separate analytics store and seamlessly integrates Azure Cosmos DB with Azure Synapse Analytics. This allows you to run analytical queries on the data using Synapse without exporting or replicating it. You have an Azure subscription. The subscription contains an Azure SQL managed instance that stores employee details, including social security numbers and phone numbers. You need to configure the managed instance to meet the following requirements. The helpdesk team must see only the last four digits of an employee's phone number. Cloud administrators must be prevented from seeing the employee's social security numbers. What should you enable for each column in the managed instance? And the first part of the question is talking about phone numbers. And your options are always encrypted, column encryption, dynamic data masking, transparent data encryption. Folks, you will need to enable dynamic data masking to ensure help desk only views last four digit of employee's phone number, as it helps prevent unauthorized access to sensitive data by enabling customers to designate how much of the sensitive data to reveal with minimal effect on the application layer. Now, the next part of the question is talking about social security numbers. And again, you have all the four same options. Folks, you should enable always encrypted feature on the instance, as it is a feature designed to protect sensitive data such as credit card numbers or national or regional identification numbers stored in Azure SQL database, Azure SQL managed instance, and even SQL Server databases. Next question. You plan to use Azure Storage Account to store data assets. You need to recommend a solution that meets the following requirements: supports immutable storage, disables anonymous access to the storage account, supports access control lists based intra-ID permissions. What should you include in the recommendation? Your options are Azure Files, Azure Data Lake Storage, Azure NetApp Files, Azure Blob Storage. Now, folks, in terms of supporting immutable storage, both Azure Data Lake Storage and Azure Blob Storage are correct, but ACL is supported by Azure Data Lake Storage and not supported by Azure Blob Storage. So making option B as the correct answer. Now, there is a link on your screen at the moment. Feel free to browse through the link to understand more about Azure Data Lake Storage. Question number 101. You plan to use Azure SQL as a database platform. You need to recommend an Azure SQL product and service tier that meets the following requirements. Automatically scales compute resources based on the workload demand, provides per second billing.
What should you recommend? And the first part of the question is talking about Azure SQL product. And your options are a single Azure SQL database, an Azure SQL database elastic pool, Azure SQL managed instance. Now, folks, the correct choice here would be a single Azure SQL database, as it supports the serverless compute tier, which can automatically scale compute resources based on the workload demand. Now, the next part of the question is talking about what should be the service tier of the database. Your options are basic, business critical, general purpose, hyperscale, or standard. And friends, the service tier should be general purpose, as serverless compute tier is part of general purpose service tier, and it also provides per second billing for compute usage when the database is active, saving costs during idle periods. Next question. You have an Azure subscription that contains a virtual network named VNet1 and 10 virtual machines. The virtual machines are connected to VNet1. You need to design a solution to manage the virtual machines from the internet. The solution must meet the following requirements. Incoming connections to the virtual machines must be authenticated by using Azure multi-factor authentication before network connectivity is allowed. Incoming connections must use TLS and connect to TCP port 443. The solution must support RDP and SSH. What should you include in the solution? Again, the first part of the question is talking about to provide access to virtual machines on VNet 1 use. Your options are Azure Bastion, just-in-time VM access, Azure Web Application Firewall in Azure Front Door. And friends, you should use Azure Bastion here as it provides secure and seamless RDP or SSH connectivity to virtual machines directly from the Azure portal over TLS. Now, the next part of the question is talking about to enforce Azure MFA use. And your options are an Azure Identity Governance Access Package, a conditional access policy that has the cloud apps assignment set to Azure Windows VM sign-in, a conditional access policy that has the cloud apps assignment set to Microsoft Azure management. Now, friends, you need to use a conditional access policy that has the cloud apps assignment set to Azure Windows VM sign-in. Then use the sign-in risk as a condition or phishing resistant MFA using require authentication strength grant control or require MFA as a control for granting access. Now, as always, again, there is a link on your screen. Go through the link to understand how you can enforce this type of conditional access policies. Question number 103 of the series. A company named DevOps Hub Limited has an Entra ID tenant that is integrated with Microsoft 365 and an Azure subscription. DevOps Hub has an on-premise identity infrastructure. The infrastructure includes servers that run Active Directory domain services and Entra Connect. DevOps Hub has a partnership with a company named Tech with Jaspal Incorporation. Tech with Jaspal has an Active Directory forest and a Microsoft 365 tenant. Now, Tech with Jaspal has the same on-premise identity infrastructure components as DevOps Hub. A team of 10 developers from Tech with Jaspal will work on an Azure solution that will be hosted in the Azure subscription of DevOps Hub. The developers must be added to the contributor role for a resource group in the DevOps Hub subscription. You need to recommend a solution to ensure that DevOps Hub can assign the role to the 10 TechWith developers. The solution must ensure that the TechWith developers use their existing credentials to access resources. What should you recommend? Your options are in the Entra ID tenant of DevOps Hub, create cloud-only user accounts for the TechWith developers. Configure a forest trust between the on-premise Active Directory forest of DevOps Hub and TechWith. Configure an organization relationship between the Microsoft 365 tenants of TechWith and DevOps Hub. In the Entra ID tenant of DevOps Hub, create guest accounts for the TechWith developers. And friends, the correct answer here is option D. This approach leverages Entra ID B2B, which is business to business collaboration, allowing external users to access resources in your Entra ID tenant using their existing credentials. This way, the Tech with Jaspal developers can use their existing credentials to access the resources in the DevOps Hub subscription. Folks, if you're liking the content, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe the channel. Let's move to question number 104 of the series. You are designing a storage solution that will ingest, store, and analyze petabytes of structured, semi-structured, and unstructured text data. The analyzed data will be offloaded to Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 for long-term retention. You need to recommend a storage and analytics solution that meets the following requirements: stores the processed data, provides interactive analytics, supports manual scaling, built-in auto-scaling, and custom auto-scaling. What should you include in the recommendation? The first part of the question is talking about for storage and interactive analytics. And your options are Azure Data Explorer, Azure Data Lake Analytics, and Log Analytics. Friends, Azure Data Explorer is optimized for storing and querying structured data, semi-structured data, and unstructured data, making it ideal for this scenario. It is specifically designed for real-time and interactive analytics on large volumes of data, enabling users to quickly derive insights. Azure Data Explorer supports a variety of scaling options to handle workload demands, including manual scaling, built-in auto-scaling, and custom auto-scaling configurations. Now, the next part of the question is talking about query language, and your options are KQL, Transact SQL, and USQL. Folks, Azure Data Explorer uses KQL as its primary query language. KQL is specifically designed for interactive and efficient querying of large volumes of structured, semi-structured, and unstructured data. It provides robust capabilities for data exploration, pattern matching, and analytics, making it ideal for real-time insights. Question number 105 of the series. You are designing a cost-optimized solution that uses Azure Batch to run two types of jobs on Linux nodes. The first job type will consist of short-running tasks for a development environment. The second job type will consist of long-running message passing interface applications for a production environment that requires timely job completion. You need to recommend the pool type and node type for each job type. The solution must minimize compute charges and leverage Azure hybrid benefit wherever possible. What should you recommend? For the first job, your options are batch service and dedicated virtual machines, user subscription and dedicated virtual machines, user subscription and spot virtual machines. Now, friends, short-running tasks in a development environment typically do not require high availability or guaranteed job completion, making spot virtual machines a cost-effective choice, and user subscription allows you to manage the batch pool using your own Azure subscription, giving you more control over VM configurations and pricing options. Now, friends, the next part of the question is talking about what should you recommend for second job, and again, you have the same options. Now, MPI workloads require high availability, low latency, and tight coupling between compute nodes, making dedicated virtual machines essential for ensuring job completions within the required timelines. And friends, user subscription provides control over VM configuration, enabling the use of Azure hybrid benefit for Linux nodes to reduce costs if eligible. Next question. Your on-premise network contains an Active Directory domain services domain. The domain contains a server named Server 1. Server 1 contains an app named App 1 that uses ADDS authentication. Remote users access App 1 by using a VPN connection to the on-premise network. You have an Entra ID tenant that syncs with the ADDS domain by using Entra Connect. You need to ensure that the remote users can access App 1 without using a VPN. The solution must meet the following requirements. Ensure that the users authenticate by using Azure multi-factor authentication and minimize administrative effort. What should you include in the solution? The first part of the question is talking about an Entra ID, and your options are a managed identity, an access package, an app registration, an enterprise application. Folks, by integrating App1 as an enterprise application in the Entra ID, you can provide secure access to the app over the internet without requiring a VPN. Enterprise applications in Entra ID can enforce conditional access policies, including requiring MFA for authentication, and enterprise application integration leverages existing identity synchronization via Entra Connect and does not require significant additional configuration beyond initial setup, thereby minimizing administrative effort. Now, the next part of the question is talking about what should you include in the solution in the on-premise. A server that runs Windows Server and has the Entra ID application proxy connector installed. A server that runs Windows Server and has the on-premise data gateway installed. A server that runs Windows Server and has web application proxy role service installed. And friends, the correct answer here is option A. Entra ID application proxy connector allows secure access to an on-premise application like App1 over the internet, eliminating the need for a VPN and supports conditional access policies, including MFA, ensuring secure user authentication. Now, folks, we have now over 100 questions in the series till now. So if you are someone who is looking to get access to the PDF version of all the questions that we have covered in the series till now, then do not forget to take the gold membership of the channel. And then you just need to email us at devopshub2023@gmail.com requesting the PDF copy. Let's move to question number 107. You are building an Azure web app that will store the personally identifiable information of employees. You need to recommend an Azure SQL database solution for the web app. The solution must meet the following requirements: maintain availability in the event of a single data center outage, support the encryption of specific columns that contain PII, automatically scale up during payroll operations, minimize costs. What should you include in the recommendation? The first part of the question is talking about service tier and compute tier. Your options are business critical service tier and serverless compute tier, general purpose service tier and serverless compute tier, hyperscale service tier and provisioned compute tier. Friends, you should include general purpose service tier and serverless compute tier. The general purpose tier uses zone redundant high availability in regions that support availability zones, ensuring resilience across single data center outages and is more cost effective compared to business critical or hyperscale tiers. Now, the next part of the question is talking about the encryption method that you should include in the recommendation. Your options are always encrypted, Microsoft SQL Server and database encryption keys, transparent data encryption. You should use always encrypted encryption method as it allows you to encrypt specific columns in the database, making it an ideal choice for securing sensitive data like personally identifiable information. Encryption and decryption occurs client-side using encryption keys stored outside of the database, ensuring that even database administrators cannot access plain text data.
Your company has 20 web APIs that were developed in-house. The company is developing 10 web apps that will use the web APIs. The web apps and the APIs are registered in the company's Entra ID tenant. The web APIs are published by using Azure API management. You need to recommend a solution to block unauthorized requests originating from the web apps from reaching the web APIs. The solution must meet the following requirements. Use Entra ID generated claims, minimize configuration and management effort. What should you include in the recommendation? And the first part of the question is talking about grant permissions to allow the web apps to access the web APIs by using which of the following. And your options are Entra ID, Azure API management, the web APIs. And friends, the correct answer here is option A, Entra ID. As Entra ID can issue tokens containing claims that the APIs can validate, ensuring only authorized applications access the APIs and also satisfying the first requirement being mentioned in the question. And friends, the next part of the question is talking about configure a JSON web token validation policy by using And your options are Entra ID, Azure API Management, and the Web APIs. Now, friends, the correct answer here is option B. Azure API Management can enforce JOT validation policies, ensuring that only requests with valid Entra ID generated JOTs are allowed to access the APIs. This minimizes configuration and management effort while leveraging Entra ID for claims. Next question. Your company plans to deploy various Azure App Service instances that will use Azure SQL databases. The app service instances will be deployed at the same time as the Azure SQL databases. The company has a regulatory requirement to deploy the app service instance only to specific Azure regions. The resources for the app service instance must reside in the same region. You need to recommend a solution to meet the regulatory requirement. And the solution you choose is you recommend using an Azure policy initiative to enforce the location of resource groups. Does this meet the goal? You need to tell whether this is right or wrong. And friends, this is the incorrect solution. The location of resource group has nothing to do with the location of the resources inside the resource group. You will need to enforce the policy directly on the resource themselves to ensure they are deployed in the same region. Question number 110 of the series. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1 that is linked to a hybrid Microsoft Entra tenant. You have an on-premise data center that does not have a VPN connection to Subscription 1. Note it says does not have a VPN connection to Subscription 1. The data center contains a computer named Server 1 that has Microsoft SQL Server 2022 installed. Server is prevented from accessing the internet. An Azure Logic App resource named Logic App 1 requires write access to a database on Server 1. You need to recommend a solution to provide Logic App 1 with the ability to access Server 1. What should you recommend deploying on-premise and in Azure? Now, the first part of the question is talking about the on-premise deployment. And your options are a web application proxy for Windows Server, an Entra ID application proxy connector, an on-premise data gateway, hybrid connection manager. And friends, you should configure the on-premise data gateway to allow Logic App 1 to access the SQL Server database on Server 1. On-premise data gateway enables secure communication between on-premise data sources such as SQL Server and Azure services like Logic Apps, and it does not require the on-premise server to have direct internet access. Instead, the gateway communicates with Azure over HTTPS outbound traffic. Now, the next part of the question is talking about what should you deploy in Azure. And your options are a connection gateway resource, an Azure application gateway, an Azure event grid domain, an enterprise application. Now, folks, you should deploy a connection gateway resource which is associated with the on-premise data gateway. The connection gateway in Azure is configured alongside the on-premise data gateway installed in the on-premise environment. This enables Azure Logic Apps to securely communicate with on-premise resources like SQL Server databases. Now, there is a link on your screen at the moment. You can go through the link to understand how this all concept which I just explained works in more detail. Next question. You manage a database environment for a Microsoft volume licensing customer named Tech with Jaspal Limited. Tech with Jaspal uses license mobility through software assurance. You need to deploy 50 databases, and the solution must meet the following requirements: support automatic scaling, minimize Microsoft SQL Server licensing costs. What should you include in the solution? And the first part of the question is talking about purchase model. And your options are DTU, vCore, Azure Reserved Virtual Machine instances. And friends, you should choose vCore purchase model. vCore model provides a more direct way to choose compute and storage resources, and it can offer cost savings. The vCore based purchasing model also allows you to use Azure Hybrid benefit to save on licensing costs. Now, the next part of the question is talking about what should be your deployment option. And your options are an Azure SQL managed instance, an Azure SQL database elastic pool, a SQL server always on availability group. Friends, Azure SQL Database Elastic Pool should be chosen as a deployment option as they are simple, cost-effective solution for managing and scaling multiple databases that have varying and unpredictable usage demands. Elastic pools enable you to purchase resources for a pool shared by multiple databases to accommodate unpredictable periods of usage by individual databases. You can allocate exactly the resources you need for your databases in a flexible, budget-friendly way. Question number 112. You have an Azure subscription that contains the resources in the following table. You basically have three resources. First is with the name of app1 and is a Azure App Service app. The next one is a log analytics workspace with the name of workspace 1 and is configured to use a pay-as-you-go pricing tier. Now the next one is a log analytics table with the name of app1 logs. It is hosted in the log analytics workspace and is configured to use the analytics logs data plan. Now log files from app1 are registered to app1 logs. An average of 120 GB of log data is ingested per day. You configure an Azure Monitor alert that will be triggered if the app1 logs contain error messages. You need to minimize the log analytics cost associated with app1. The solution must meet the following requirements. Ensure that all the log files from app1 are ingested to app1 logs. Minimize the impact on the Azure Monitor alert. Which resources should you modify and which modifications should you perform? Now, the first part of the question is talking about resources, and your options are app1, app logs, and workspace 1, which are the three resources which were mentioned in the table. And friends, the resource that you should modify is workspace 1. This is the log analytics workspace where the logs are ingested. Modifying this resource helps manage costs associated with log ingestion. Now, the next part of the question is talking about modification. And your options are change to a commitment pricing tier, change to the basic logs data plan, set a daily cap. Now, since we have an average of 120 GB of log data per day, to minimize cost and impact, we should change the workspace 1 plan from pay as you go to commitment pricing tier. With commitment pricing tier, you can commit to buy data ingestion for a workspace starting at 100 GB per day at a lower price than pay as you go pricing. So folks, I hope you now understand why I have chosen these options as the correct answer. But if you still have any doubts, please post them in the comment section. Question number 113. You have an on-premise line of business application that uses a Microsoft SQL Server instance as the backend. You plan to migrate the on-premise SQL Server instance to Azure virtual machines. You need to recommend a highly available SQL Server deployment that meets the following requirements. Minimize costs, minimizes failover time if a single server fails. What should you include in the recommendation? An always-on availability group that has premium storage disks and a virtual network name. An always-on failover cluster instance that has a virtual network name and a standard file share. An always-on availability group that has premium storage disks and a distributed network name. An always-on failover cluster instance that has a virtual network name and a premium file share. Now folks, the correct answer here is option B. Always on failover cluster instance with a standard file share is most cost effective compared to other options that require premium storage, and FCI provides automatic failover with near zero downtime. Because the SQL Server instance runs as a single logical instance, the virtual network name ensures clients connect to the same logical server instance regardless of which node is active. Now folks, if you are liking the content, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe the channel. Let's look at question number 114 of the series. You plan to develop a new app that will store business critical data. The app must meet the following requirements: prevent new data from being modified for 1 year, maximize data resiliency, minimize read latency. What storage solution should you recommend for the app? And the first part of the question is talking about the storage account type. And your options are premium block blobs, standard general purpose V1, and standard general purpose V2. Folks, you should choose premium block blob storage account type, as that would provide lowest latency among all the storage account types, and it supports immutability policies such as time-based retention, which can ensure that new data cannot be modified for 1 year. Now, the next part of the question is talking about redundancy, and the options are zone redundant storage, which is ZRS, and locally redundant storage, which is LRS. You should choose zone redundant storage type, as it maximizes data resiliency by replicating data across multiple availability zones in the same Azure region. It offers better protection against data loss due to zone failures compared to locally redundant storage, which only replicates data within a single data center. Next question. You have two on-premise Microsoft SQL Server 2017 instances that host an always-on availability group named AG1. AG1 contains a single database named DB1. You have an Azure subscription that contains a virtual machine named VM1. VM1 runs Linux and contains a SQL Server 2022 instance. You need to migrate DB1 to VM1. The solution must minimize downtime on DB1. What should you do? Again, there are two parts of the question, and the first part of the question is talking about prepare for the migration by, and your options are adding a secondary replica to AG1, creating an always-on availability group on VM1, upgrading the on-premise SQL Server instances. Now friends, by adding the SQL Server instance on VM1 as a secondary replica in AG, DB1 can be replicated and kept in sync while the application remains online. This ensures that the primary database remains operational during the migration. And the next part of the question is talking about perform the migration by using, and your options are a distributed availability group, Azure Migrate, log shipping. Friends, you should use a distributed availability group for performing migration here. A distributed availability group allows you to connect two separate availability groups. This approach allows near zero downtime because the database on VM1 is synchronized with the on-premise database before the final cutover. After the synchronization is complete, you can fail over to the distributed AG on VM1. Next question. You have two app registrations named App1 and App2 in Entra ID. App1 supports role-based access control and includes a role named writer. You need to ensure that when App2 authenticates to access App1, the tokens issued by Entra ID include the writer role claim. Which blade should you use to modify each app registration? To answer, drag the appropriate blades to the correct app registrations. Each blade may be used once, more than once, or not at all. And you have three blades: API permissions, app roles, and token configuration. Now, folks, you should define the writer role in the app roles blade in the App1. This allows the writer role to be assigned to service principals or users accessing App1. In the App2, you add an API permission to request access to App1, specifically the permission that includes the writer role. This ensures App2 is granted the required permissions when accessing App1. Question number 117 of the series. Your company has an existing web app that runs on Azure virtual machines. You need to ensure that the app is protected from SQL injection attempts and uses a layer 7 load balancer. The solution must minimize disruptions to the code of the app. What should you recommend? To answer, drag the appropriate service to the correct targets. Each service may be used once, more than once, or not at all. Now, in the question, there are multiple services mentioned, which are Web Application Firewall, Azure Application Gateway, Azure Load Balancer, Azure Traffic Manager, SSL offloading, and URL based content routing. Now, friends, the Azure service that you should use is Azure Application Gateway. Now, Azure Application Gateway is a layer 7 load balancer that provides advanced routing capabilities, SSL termination, and WAF integration. It ensures efficient request routing based on HTTPS protocols. And friends, you should use Web Application Firewall in conjunction with Application Gateway, as WAF is specifically designed to protect against web vulnerabilities such as SQL injection and cross-site scripting. Integrating it with an Azure Application Gateway allows centralized management of web security. So folks, that's all for this part of the series. We will be back soon with more such questions in our AZ-305 exam practice question series. Till then, keep liking the content and leaving the comments on our videos so it reaches the wider audience.